It was past midnight in colonial Mexico City. The year was 1550, perhaps 1560. The Spanish residents had just heard the curfew. The streets were empty. The doors were locked. Then they listened to him. A moan. Prolonged. Heartbreaking. A woman crying, but not just any crying. The voices of the neighbors, recorded decades later, coincided. He was shouting at night, saying, "My little children, where shall I take you?" But this did not begin in the Spanish colony. This began long before. When the Mexica still ruled that same valley. When Tenochtitlan shone brightly above the lake. And what began as an omen of the end of the world, became Mexico's most enduring legend. Welcome. I'm David, and for the next 25 minutes we're going to do something different. We're not going to investigate a paranormal case. We're not going to look for ghosts or supernatural explanations. Let's do something more interesting. Let's trace how a legend survived 500 years, crossed continents, transformed with each generation, and is still completely alive today. Because La Llorona is not just a scary story grandmothers tell to frighten children. She is a documented cultural phenomenon dating back to 1558. She is a symbol of Mexico's deepest historical trauma. She is religious syncretism. She is collective memory. She is national identity. And it all began with a goddess. What happens when an entire world disappears? How does a culture process its own destruction? And why does that memory transform into a woman who weeps eternally for her lost children? This is the story of Cihuacóatl, the Serpent Woman. Of the omens that foretold the end of an empire. And of how that ancient cry resonated through 5 centuries until it reached a Warner Brothers film in 2019 that grossed $123 million. But before we get to Hollywood, we have to travel to the Valley of Mexico. 1509, 10 years before Hernán Cortés set foot on Mexican soil. Imagine the largest city in the Americas. Tenochtitlan. More than 200,000 inhabitants. Causeways over the lake. Temples that shimmer in the sun. The Tlatelolco market where 60,000 people gather every day. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma II to us, rules the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica. It is 1519. In Europe, Leonardo da Vinci has just died. Charles I rules Spain. And here, in the Mexican highlands, no one imagines that this world is only a few months old. But according to the elderly who survived, there were signs. Now here's something fascinating. Everything we know about these omens comes from a Spanish Franciscan named Bernardino de Sahagun. Sahagun arrived in Mexico in 1529, 10 years after the conquest. And he was the first to do something no one had done before. He sat down with the indigenous elders, people who had lived through the fall of Tenochtitlan, and asked them, what happened? Tell me in your own words. For decades he collected testimonies. In Nahuatl. Methodically. Rigorously. He created the Florentine Codex between 1558 and 1577. 12 books. Thousands of pages. Illustrations. Today it's in Florence, Italy. And you can see it digitized. It's the most important document for understanding the indigenous perspective on the conquest. And in Book 12, are the 8 ominous portents. Sahagun's informants said that approximately 10 years before the arrival of the Spaniards, 8 terrible signs occurred. First, a fiery streak appeared in the night sky for an entire year. Probably a comet. Second, the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, spontaneously caught fire. No one could put it out. Third, a lightning bolt struck the temple of Cihuacóatl. Strange, because there was no thunder. It wasn't raining. Fourth, a 3-headed comet crossed the sky, during the day. Fifth, Lake Texcoco boiled for no apparent reason. It rose in giant waves and destroyed houses. Sixth, the fishermen found a strange gray bird. It had a mirror on its head. They took it to Moctezuma. He looked in the mirror and saw unknown warriors riding giant deer. Seventh, deformed people appeared in the streets. 2 heads. Bodies joined together. They were taken before Moctezuma, and disappeared. And the eighth. The sixth omen is our starting point. The elders said. Many times a woman could be heard crying and shouting. She would go around saying, "My children, we are leaving now." Sometimes she would say, "My children, where will I take you?" She appeared at night. Especially when there was a full moon. She walked the streets of Tenochtitlan. And her voice was heartbreaking. Who was he? Cihuacóatl. The Serpent Woman. Cihuacóatl was not a minor goddess. She was fundamental to the Mexica cosmogony. Goddess of fertility. Of the earth. Protector of women who died in childbirth, the Cihuatl, who became deities, equivalent to warriors fallen in battle. Sahagan describes it. She often appeared as a well-dressed lady in finery like that worn in the palace. The finery was white, and her hair was styled in such a way that it resembled crossed horns on her forehead. At night he shouted and roared in the air. And now, she was crying for her children. The Mexica people were her children. And she knew what was coming. But here's a crucial question we need to ask ourselves. We need to pause. Because there's something important we need to understand about these omens. Sahagan compiled these testimonies between 1558 and 1577. That is, 40 to 60 years after the conquest. Did the omens really occur before 1519? Or are they a way of making sense, in retrospect, of an incomprehensible trauma? Historian Berenice Alcántara Rojas, from the Institute of Historical Research at UNAM, has a fascinating theory. Sahagan's Nahua collaborators were educated at the College of Tlatelolco. They knew Latin. They had read classical European texts. And those texts, about the fall of Troy, the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Rome, all included omens. It is a universal narrative structure. Before an empire falls, the gods send signs. Does this mean the informants invented the omens? Not necessarily. Perhaps they reinterpreted real events, a comet, a fire, through this lens. Perhaps genuine oral traditions existed that were, let's say, organized according to patterns that made sense to a 16th-century audience. What we do know for sure is this: there was a tradition about Cihuacóatl crying. And that tradition survived. Let's move forward a few decades. Mid-16th century. 1550, 1560, maybe 1570. Colonial Mexico City rises upon its ruins. The temples are now churches. The lake is being drained. Spaniards and Creoles live in the center. The indigenous people on the periphery. And then, the Spanish neighbors start talking about something strange. This is documented by Luis González Obregón in his 1922 book, Las Calles de Mexico, The Streets of Mexico. González Obregón was the city's chronicler and compiled 19th-century oral traditions, which in turn came from 16th-century traditions. Cover of the book, The Streets of Mexico. Let me read you the whole text. Because it's fascinating. Narrative tone, as if reading an old document. After the conquest was completed, around the middle of the 16th century, the residents of Mexico City, who were staying in their homes at curfew, signaled by the bells of the first cathedral, would wake up terrified at midnight, especially when there was a moon, upon hearing in the street sad and very prolonged moans, uttered by a woman who was undoubtedly suffering from deep moral sorrow or tremendous physical pain. The testimonies coincided in the sequence. Time, after midnight, when the bells were ringing for curfew. Starting point, the streets near the Plaza Mayor, today the Zocalo. Route, I walked slowly through the colonial streets. Final destination, the shore of the lake. What remained of the ancient Lake Texcoco? And then, he disappeared. As if he were submerging himself in the water. González Obregón describes. A woman dressed in white, with a white veil covering her face. Her gait was slow, her air mysterious. He would arrive at the Plaza Mayor. He would kneel. He would look towards the east, where the sun rises, where in the Mesoamerican worldview lies the origin of life. And he uttered a lament. Sharp. Piercing. Extremely prolonged. The bravest conquerors, men who had survived battles, who had conquered an empire, were afraid of him. Another chronicler, José María Marroquí, wrote, "In the presence of that woman, they remained silent, pale, and cold, like marble. Some tried to follow her. At a distance. Taking advantage of the moonlight. They could never reach her. And when they got to the lake, she vanished." And this is where the story multiplies. Because a legend doesn't remain static. It changes. It adapts. It absorbs new layers. At the end of the 16th century and during the 17th century, versions with a more complete narrative began to circulate. Version 1, the infanticidal mother. An indigenous woman falls in love with a Spanish gentleman. They have children. He promises to marry her. But then he abandons her to marry a Spanish lady of his own class. In her madness, in her pain, she takes her children to the lake. And he drowns them. When he realizes what he has done, he takes his own life. But her soul finds no peace. She is condemned to wander eternally, searching for the children she herself murdered. Her cry, "Oh, my children, where are my children?" Version 2, La Malinche. Some accounts identified her with Malintzin, La Malinche, the Nahua woman who was interpreter and consort of Hernán Cortés. In this version, she weeps not only for her biological children, but for having betrayed her people, for having facilitated the conquest. This version has no historical basis. Malintzin died around 1529, probably from smallpox, and was buried. But legend doesn't need facts. It needs meaning. Version 3, multiple regional variants. In Veracruz, La Llorona is associated with the waters of the Gulf. She lures men to their doom. In Chiapas, she is the spirit of an indigenous woman murdered during the conquest. She weeps for her people, not just for her children. In Oaxaca, it has stronger connections with fertility cycles and the life-death duality. Do you see the pattern? What is happening here is cultural syncretism. A pre-Hispanic deity, Cihuacóatl, is merging with colonial Catholic moral values. Cihuacóatl wept for the end of the Mexica world. For her children, the people, who would be destroyed. The colonial La Llorona weeps for the real children she killed. It is divine punishment. For infanticide. For illicit relationships between races. For breaking social norms. It becomes a tool for social control. For children, be good or La Llorona will get you. For women, don't break the rules or you will suffer eternally. For society, this is what happens when the rules are broken. But at the same time, it holds something deeper. Because if you think about it, who are the children that La Llorona lost? The pre-Hispanic world. The Nahua culture. The millions who died from war, disease, and slavery. La Llorona becomes the symbol of painful mestizage, of Mexico's foundational trauma. An indigenous woman. A Spanish man. Mixed-race children. Abandonment. Violence. Death. Eternal guilt. It is the story of the conquest, condensed into a figure weeping by the water where Tenochtitlan once shone. Miguel León-Portilla, the most important Mexican anthropologist and historian of the 20th century, wrote about this in The Vision of the Vanquished. La Llorona is collective memory. It's how a culture remembers a trauma so profound it can't be processed directly. So it transforms into myth. Into legend. Into something that can be recounted, generation after generation. And that legend never died. La Llorona has not been studied only by folklore enthusiasts. She is the subject of serious academic research. The National Autonomous University of Mexico has numerous undergraduate, master's, and doctoral theses on the subject. The National Institute of Anthropology and History. El Colegio de Mexico. Patrick Johansson Keraudren, a French researcher at the Institute of Historical Research of the UNAM, an expert in Nahuatl and Mesoamerican worldview, has studied the connection between Cihuacóatl and La Llorona for decades. His conclusion: the legend has genuine roots in pre-Hispanic mythology, but it was reinterpreted and transformed during the colonial period to serve new social functions. Johansson explains something fascinating about the Cihuacóatl, the women who died in childbirth. In the Mexica worldview, dying in childbirth was equivalent to dying in battle. The Cihuacóatl became warrior deities. They accompanied the sun from its zenith to its setting. And some nights, they wandered the earth. Cihuacóatl was her protector. After the conquest, when millions died, from war, disease, the destruction of their world, the entire Mexica civilization became, metaphorically, Cihuacóatl. They died in the birth of a new world. And Cihuacóatl weeps for them. It's powerful, isn't it? The researchers agree on several points. 1. The legend has a documented pre-Hispanic origin in Cihuacóatl. 2. The omens of the Florentine Codex were probably post-conquest narrative constructions, influenced by classical European texts, but based on real oral traditions. 3. The legend was transformed during the colonial period, incorporating Christian elements and a moralizing function. 4. It represents the historical trauma of the conquest and the painful mixing of races. 5. Its persistence for 500 years is due to the fact that it fulfills multiple functions: pedagogical, social, psychological, identity-related. And here we need to be clear. There are no serious scientific investigations seeking to validate paranormal appearances of La Llorona. There is no physical evidence of supernatural events. There are no verifiable witnesses to unexplained phenomena. There are no declassified government documents regarding sightings. All serious research is cultural, historical, anthropological, psychological. La Llorona is a legend. And that doesn't make her any less important. In fact, it makes her more important. Because legends tell us truths about ourselves that facts alone cannot convey. Then we come to the crucial question: why this legend? Mexico has hundreds of colonial legends. Most have disappeared. Why has La Llorona survived 500 years and is still very much alive? Theory 1: Universal archetype. Carl Jung would speak of the terrible mother, the dark side of the maternal archetype. The mother who creates life, but can also destroy it. This figure exists in all cultures. Medea in Greece, she kills her children in revenge against her husband. Lilith in Hebrew tradition, female demon who attacks children. Banshee in Ireland, a female spirit that cries out announcing death. Pontianak in Indonesia, spirit of a woman who died in childbirth. La Llorona connects with something universally human: the fear of losing children, maternal guilt, the terrifying power of motherhood. Theory 2: Current social function. The legend remains useful. To protect children near water, don't go near the river or La Llorona will take you. To transmit values, consequences of actions, moral responsibility. To create social cohesion, a shared myth creates a common identity. Theory 3: Adaptability. The legend transforms according to each era but maintains its emotional core. 16th century, pre-Hispanic omen. 17th century, punishment for infanticide. 19th century, Mexican national identity. 20th century, golden age of cinema. 21st century, global horror, Warner Brothers, streaming. In the 2000s, there were reports of La Llorona on highways. She no longer walks beside colonial lakes. She appears on freeways. She adapts to modern, urbanized Mexico. Theory 4: Unresolved trauma. More serious, deeper tone. And maybe, just maybe, the legend persists because the trauma it represents has not been fully processed. Mexico is a mestizo country born of violence. The conquest. Colonization. Centuries of racial and social inequality. A complex, divided identity. La Llorona is that pain transformed into a symbol. And as long as that pain remains part of the national identity, she will continue to weep. Of course, there are perfectly rational explanations for the historical sightings. 1. Animal sounds. Coyotes, owls, and other nocturnal animals can produce creepy sounds, especially in the dark and amplified by superstition. 2. Acoustic phenomena, echoes in narrow colonial streets. Wind between buildings. Misinterpreted sounds of the lake and wetlands. 3. Real women, women who had actually lost children, grieving in the night. In an era of high infant mortality, this would not have been unusual. 4th, deliberate social control. There are documented cases from the 19th century of thieves disguised as La Llorona to scare people and be able to steal undisturbed. Colonial authorities may also have used superstition to keep people at home after curfew. All of these explanations are valid. But they don't explain why the legend means so much to so many people. Today, La Llorona is music. The traditional song La Llorona has been performed by Shavila Vargas, Lila Downs, and Angela Aguilar. It appeared in the Pixar film Coco. Cinema, from the first film in 1933 to The Curse of La Llorona in 2019. Dozens of adaptations. Literature, countless stories, novels, poems. Identity, ask any Mexican, from any social class, from any region. Everyone knows La Llorona. It's part of being Mexican. And it has expanded. Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Ecuador, Colombia. Each country has its own version. In the United States, Latino communities keep the tradition alive. La Llorona has become part of Latino American folklore. He is a global legend with deeply local roots. So, what is La Llorona? It's not a ghost you can investigate with electromagnetic equipment. There's no evidence to analyze in a lab. There's no case to solve. But it's real in the sense that matters most. It is how a culture remembers. It processes trauma. It transmits values. It builds identity. It is Cihuacóatl weeping for the end of a world. It is a colonized mother drowning her mestizo children. It is the pain of the conquest that never ends. It is the grandmother's warning to the children by the river. It's 500 years of Mexican history, condensed into a figure dressed in white who cries by the water. And perhaps the most fascinating thing is this: La Llorona doesn't need to be real, in a literal sense, to have a profound impact on millions of people. Legends are not lies. They are emotional truths. Cultural truths. Historical truths told in a different way. Patrick Johansson, the UNAM researcher we mentioned, said something that I think is perfect to conclude. The enduring presence of La Llorona isn't due to people literally believing in apparitions. It's because she represents something that needs to be remembered, the pain of a vanished world and the violent birth of a new one. Today, Lake Texcoco is almost gone. It was drained to build modern Mexico City. The great Tenochtitlan lies buried beneath concrete and asphalt. But his memory persists. In every grandmother who tells her grandchildren, "Don't go out at night or La Llorona will get you." In every film, every song, every story that continues to be told. The fact that you, yes, you who are watching this, probably knew this legend before you pressed play on this video. That's what makes a legend powerful. Not its literal truth, but its permanence. So the next time you hear the story of La Llorona, in a movie, in a conversation, on a dark night, think about this. You're not listening to a simple horror story. You are hearing an echo that has traveled 500 years. From the temples of Tenochtitlan to the colonial streets. From the oral history of Nahua elders to Hollywood films. From Cihuacóatl to a woman dressed in white by the water. You are listening to how a culture processes its own destruction and rebirth. You are listening to memory transformed into myth. History transformed into legend. And perhaps, you are listening to your own ancestors. Because if you have Mexican or Latin American roots, if mixed heritage is part of your story, then La Llorona is crying for you too. For the worlds your ancestors lost. For the fragmented identities. For the pain that is passed down from generation to generation without us always knowing why. She continues to cry. Not because she needs us to literally believe in her. But because we need to remember. And now I want to know what you think. Were you aware of the connection between La Llorona and Cihuacóatl? Does your family have a particular version of the legend? What do you think explains its persistence for 500 years? Leave it in the comments. I want to read your stories, your theories, your experiences with this legend. If this video made you see La Llorona differently, not just as a horror story but as a profound cultural symbol, give it a like. Help more people learn the true story behind the legend. And subscribe because we're going to continue exploring legends, myths, and historical cases from Mexico and Latin America. But always with this same depth. Always seeking what they tell us about ourselves.